Hi and welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. I'm your host Matt, and today we've got the first look at the GeForce GTX 950 graphics card. Nvidia's new GTX 950 is the new $150 GPU on the block. Codenamed G206, it's based on the same Maxwell design as the GTX 960. This means the die size and the transistor count match that of the GTX 960. What has been changed is the core configuration, which sees 25% of the CUDA cores and texture units disabled. In total, there are 768 single precision CUDA cores, 48 texture units, and 32 ROPs. Unfortunately, this means the GTX 950 shares the same Achilles heel, a dismal 128-bit memory bus, trumped by the Radeon R7 370's 256-bit memory bus, the GTX 950's nearest competitor. This means that the GTX 950 has a little over 40% less memory bandwidth by comparison. Where the GTX 960 featured a 1127 MHz core-based clock, the GTX 950 will run 9% slower at 1024 MHz with a boost clock speed of 1188 MHz. The GDDR5 memory is also 6% slower at 1650 MHz. The thermal design power rating is just 90 watts for the GTX 950, and Nvidia suggested that gamers will only need a 350 watt power supply. Having said that, let's go and see what the GTX 950 produces in the real world. We're going to be benchmarking at 1080p, let's see how it performs. The GTX 950 gets off to a great start. In Assassin's Creed Unity, it managed a healthy 35 frames per second, edging out the R7 370 by a couple of frames and 10 frames behind the GTX 960. In Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, the 950 performed well again. It managed 94 frames per second, which was 22% more than the R7 370. That said, it was also 22% slower than the GTX 960. Next up are our Crysis 3 results, where both the GTX 760 and 960 were able to beat the 950. Again, it eclipsed the R7 370, but only by a couple of frames. The 950 performed well again in Dying Light, managing 40 frames per second. This was just 5 frames per second shy of the GTX 960, but an impressive 9 frames faster than the R7 370. In F1 2015, the GTX 950 was able to match the GTX 760 again with 52 frames per second apiece. The R7 370 was just 3 frames per second behind, and the GTX 960 scored 12 frames more with 64. The results in GTA 5 were very similar to F1 2015. The 950 and 760 were neck and neck at 82 frames per second, 10% ahead of the R7 370 and 15% behind the GTX 960. In Battlefield Hardline, the results were again similar. This time the 760 edged out the 950 by a single frame, and the R7 370 was just shy of 16% behind. The GTX 960 was 20% faster in this test. The 950 overclocked well, reaching 1284 MHz without any additional voltage. That's a massive 25% overclock. The GDDR5 memory reached 1778 MHz, which was a decent 8% overclock, and at that frequency surpassed the GTX 960. Before jumping to the overclocking results, I'd like to just mention that when overclocked, the Zotac GTX 950 never exceeded 74 degrees, and at the stock frequencies peaked at 71 degrees. Testing with Middle-earth, we found that the overclocked GTX 950 was now able to match the R7 370 with 36 frames per second. And even more impressively, it was just 2 frames slower than the GTX 960. In F1 2015, the overclocked 950 was just 3 frames per second slower than the GTX 960 with 61 frames per second. This was an impressive 9 frames per second improvement, placing it 12 frames per second ahead of the R7 370. In Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, the overclocked 950 was again able to match the performance of the GTX 960 with 113 frames per second. This is also again 9 frames per second faster than the 950 and a pretty significant 47% faster than the R7 370. This is where the Maxwell architecture has been the most impressive when looking at power consumption. The GTX 950 was often found matching the GTX 760, and yet we see a rather large 20% reduction in power consumption. The entire system, which includes the Core i7 4970K processor and GeForce GTX 950 GPU, consumed just 171 watts when playing Dying Light, and this is why Nvidia recommends a power supply with a 350 watt output. The 950 results were surprisingly good, better than expected. On paper, the 950 should be around 25% slower than the 960, but in reality the results were much closer than that. We found in our test that the 950 was on average just 17% slower than the 960, which was quite impressive. More surprising was the fact that the 950 on average was 45% faster than the 750 Ti. The 950 only features 20% more CUDA cores, but combine that with the 20% greater memory bandwidth and things start to weigh heavily in the 950's favour. When compared to the R7 370, we found that the 950 provided 11% better gaming performance. The 950 also overclocked really well without adjusting the voltage, and temperatures remain relatively low. Coming in price at $150, we can no doubt expect to see AMD slash the price of the R7 370 and introduce the faster 370X at the same price point. This has been Matt for Hardware Unboxed. Let me know what you think in the comments, hit like, hit subscribe, and we'll see you next time.